Hello guys, welcome to section 5. We're going to make sure we get through all of this content in a thorough and clear way. So we've just explored the importance of self-restraint and non-self-restraint, self-indulgence versus non-self-indulgence. Which way is the better way to live a good life and a happy life? And that led us into a massive discussion about pleasure. Do you fill the jar constantly or do you fill it and be satisfied? What do you do? And that would then put us in place to see whether or not it is a good thing to be constantly filling the jar. Because obviously Callicles is still stuck on this idea that you should still constantly fill the jar, i.e. you should still constantly seek pleasure, never fill up and be satisfied, constantly go out there, expand your desires and fulfill them through your cleverness and through your knowledge, etc. Okay? So that leads us into a section where we actually start to explore what good and bad are and whether or not good is synonymous with pleasure. And I think that if you are being really, really clear here, it's implied that pursuing pleasure doesn't necessarily mean you're going to live a good life, or does it, right? So that's what we're going to explore now. We're going to explore the role notions of good and bad play in allowing Callicles and Socrates to pass judgment on people, because that's what happens. We need to follow these success criteria. We need to question whether good is synonymous with pleasure. Is it the same thing, right? Is it a good life, really? Question being asked or being implied is it a good life to seek a pleasurable life? That's something that's got to be explored. We need to understand the importance of good and bad for allowing Callicles to construct a consistent argument, because he's saying quite clearly the clever, the able in politics, with the right knowledge, should go out there and pursue what they want, take what they can, the lion's share of what they can. And what that means is that they grow and nurture all their desires and fulfill as many desires as they can forever. Okay, so he has to keep saying that this is a good thing to do. This is the right thing to do because the laws of nature dictate it. This is good. Yeah. However, Socrates, who's basically saying, no, it's better to fill the jar and be content and appreciate it, might want to dissect and explore what good means and question the assumption whether or not it is good, or good is the same thing as pleasure, if they're the synonymous or they are similar things, or if they're highly related things. Okay. So I want you to draw a picture of you eating a chocolate cake, because that's been my major visual reference point for pleasure. And it really gets you thinking about the role of pleasure and whether or not it is a good thing or if it just is a pleasurable thing. Is pleasure the same as good? That's the main question we're going to ask today. Okay, so in the section we'll read after this, Socrates asks a very important question to Callicles. He says, can you confirm that living a life of unrestrained, infinite pleasure is a good thing? Is it good? And this is where that idea of synonymous means. Synonymous doesn't mean that the two words mean exactly the same thing, but it means that they overlap in terms of their meaning, okay, a lot. So can you confirm that a life of unrestrained pleasure is good, right? And then on the side, it's a little bit of a tangential argument, but it's still something I need to raise in case you get confused while we're reading the text. He also does ask whether knowledge and courage are different. Don't know why, but we'll explore that a bit later. Okay. So I think you need to write down that question. He's asking, can you confirm that living a life of unrestrained pleasure is the same thing as good? Is it the good thing? Is pleasure, the pursuit of pleasure, but also pleasure in and of itself, good? Are the two synonymous? Write some notes. And not surprisingly, Socrates says pleasure does not equal good. Okay, they're not synonymous. And the reason why he says that is because we need to look at opposites. Now, the opposite between good is good and bad. We know that they are two opposing things. But let's look at these apples here, and they were picked deliberately from Google Images because in this case, the way bad is being defined is that the worm is eating the apple. And the way good is being defined is that the apple is pure and left untouched. Now, I picked that deliberately to make one point. You can't have these two opposites existing at the same time. You can't have a situation where the apple is pure and untouched and where the apple is being eaten at the same time. The two are mutually exclusive states, okay? So just remember that because that's important. Later on, he goes on to talk about good health versus bad health. And the same thing happens here. Good health means a certain set of practices and ways of living your life that, for the most part, are completely opposite to the way you would live an unhealthy or uh, bad quality life, bad health, all right? So, you can't have both, right? You have to exercise, you have to eat well, you have to do these things to stay close to 100% healthy. I mean, you could eat, someone's going to be quite smart now and you say, oh, but I could eat a cheeseburger and um, and exercise, and yes, you could. That would make you healthy. That'd bring you closer to healthy. But if you didn't eat the cheeseburger and you did the running and you ate nutritional food, you'd be even more healthy. So you do have this state of like the pure absolute meaning of good health is completely juxtaposed. It's the direct opposite of the pure and absolute meaning of ill health or poor health, right? Those two terms can never exist exclusively. You can have qualities in between. I'll totally agree with that. But according to our man Socrates, right, the pure absolute definitions of the two terms, good health and ill health, they cannot coexist in the same body, in the same person. So good and bad are exclusive. And let's look at that as another example, okay? Let's have a look at this laksa. Love curry laksa. It's one of the best things ever, all right? Now, a hot laksa can be hot and yummy at the same time. And so hot and yummy are not mutually exclusive things. They're not opposites, okay? But you can't have a beautifully well-cooked, nice, warm curry laksa, which is also frozen. The hot, heated up laksa cannot be a frozen laksa. The two cannot mutually exist. That is why hot and frozen, or hot water and frozen water, or cold and hot, are complete opposites because they can't coexist simultaneously in the same thing. They can't coexist, all right? And that's really important because anything that can coexist is not an opposite. Take a note. You need to record this because it'll make sense later when he gets really, really cluey and he starts talking about pleasure and distress, okay? So take a note. All right, so this is why he's saying good and bad can't coexist. Good and bad things, so the idea of good and the idea of bad cannot be the same thing. They just cannot coexist, right? And he says that if something does coexist or is lost at the same time, it is neither good nor bad. So yummy, and I don't know, I'm trying to think of certain things. Well, this becomes more apparent later. Just keep this in your mind. If it coexists or is lost at the same time, it can be neither good nor bad, right? Which goes back to the same fact that if I lose yummy and hot at the same time, which is quite easy, I can totally do that when it's frozen. It's no longer yummy and it's no longer hot. We know they're not opposites, right? Most of us probably assume that hot and yummy is good because it's hot and yummy, whereas this, not so good. Probably bad in our opinion, okay? So if they coexist at the same time, these two things cannot be good or bad, right? And I guess, well, yeah, we can explore that in a minute, okay? So Callicles is going, yeah, all right, totally agree. Can't really disagree with that. So then Callicles goes, okay, well, I've got a question for you, and here's my question. All right, think of a person who's thirsty, and then think of that person having a drink. Okay. When they're thirsty, are they not distressed? When they're drinking, isn't it a pleasant feeling to actually be satiating or dealing with your thirst? And Callicles goes, yes, totally agree. And then Socrates goes, but hang on, at that instant, pleasure and distress are coexisting at the same time and they're lost at the same time. Right. So if pleasure and distress coexist at the same time, this is why, right? What motivates you to satiate your thirst and then keep drinking? It's the fact that you are thirsty. Now, of course, you're at your most thirsty when you haven't started drinking. But while you're drinking a fair bit of this, you are still thirsty because you want to keep drinking and drinking. So you are experiencing the distress or the thirst, which is the motivation to drink, at the same time that you're experiencing the pleasure of satiating that thirst. Okay? And that means that pleasure and distress are existing at the same time. And we all know that distress is a bad thing. But if distress and pleasure can exist at the same time, then pleasure, right, cannot necessarily be a good thing. All right? And that is the point. They coexist. Another thing to consider also is that pleasure is lost as distress is removed. So as I'm satiating my thirst, when I finally finish it, I don't have the pleasure of being able to satiate it anymore. So both are lost at the same time. So they coexist at the same time, and then they are basically lost at the same time. And this means that they can't be opposites. Pleasure and distress cannot be opposites, but good and bad have to be opposites. So how can you say that pleasure equals good if we know that distress is bad when pleasure and distress can exist at the same time? Take a note. All right, so here, right, we need to just go over this again. Distress is a bad thing. It is not a good thing. All right. So therefore, pleasure, which can exist at the same time, isn't necessarily a good thing. That's really important to take into account. So Callicles says, sorry. Clever words, but I don't really agree with you there, man. Sorry. And Socrates goes, oh, well, then I'll have to just keep making my point with examples. I'll just have to keep doing this, all right? So how do you describe someone good? Well, you always say that they have good qualities. Yeah? Callicles goes, yep, totally agree with that. What's the point, though? Yeah, they have good qualities. All right. Okay, he says that's not really convincing you. So let's go ahead and let's look at the question of who is more pleased by the enemies retreating. So this is another example. Is the coward more pleased by your enemies running away or the brave man? And he says, look, both would feel pleasure, but I'm pretty much sure that the lion would feel a more intense kind of pleasure. Oh, sorry, not the lion, the cowardly lion from The Wizard of Oz. And then he asks another question. Okay, well, who would feel more upset if the enemy advances and gets closer? Well, obviously, the coward would feel more intense stress. Okay. And Callicles says, yep, totally agree. All right, well, hang on then, man, he says. If the coward and the brave man are capable of feeling distress, which is supposed to be a negative thing, and pleasure, then how can you tell if who's a good or bad person? Because both are feeling both the positive or negative things. So if they've both got this positive and negative thing inside of them, then how can you say one's good and one's bad? Because they both feel it, even though they're kind of triggered off by different scenarios. And by that I mean the coward obviously feels happier under different circumstances than the brave man, but both are capable of having the same kind of feelings of distress and pleasure. So then um, how can you say that this person is good or bad? Or you probably can say this person is good or bad, but it doesn't mean that pleasure or distress tell you something about whether or not someone's good or bad, because both feel pleasure and distress. Okay. Same goes for the stupid man. And I don't believe Forrest Gump is, well, he has a low IQ, but he's smart in other ways. But I just picked this so that way you could have a good reference point. The stupid man or the clever man, that's supposed to be a picture of Einstein. The stupid man or the clever man, they both would feel pleasure and distress under different circumstances. But you can't necessarily say whether or not they are good or bad because they both experience pleasure or stress. So you can't really tell if a person is a good or bad person based on pleasure. But then again, too, he's also saying if pleasure can exist at the same time someone is distressed, pleasure doesn't necessarily mean that someone is a bad person, right? Also, he says this really weird thing at the end. He says, look, if you possess a good quality, that would make you a good person. And of course, Callicles would go, yep, all right. So if you possess a bad quality, that would make you a bad person. And you say, yes. Well, then pleasure and stress tell you nothing because all good people and bad people feel pleasure and stress. And also, pleasure isn't necessarily synonymous with what good is. All right? So take some notes. That's where we finish, and we'll do the reading next class. Okay?